Hello, today I want to talk about herbs and why my preference is to use them in a dried form. Now, this is forming part of the herb series that I have been recording, and today, instead of talking about a very particular herb, I'm going to talk about the reasons as to why I usually prefer the dried form of a herb compared to other ways in which you can engage with a herb. Also want to remind you, I'm not a medical practitioner. If you're pregnant and or breastfeeding, you should be erring on the side of caution. And then also you want to be making sure that you're doing allergy tests before you are first engaging with a herb that you are not very familiar with, in the sense of introducing it to your body. So yes, there's obviously lots of ways that herbs can come in. Obviously you can obtain them fresh sometimes, dried, as I've said. You can get them in tinctures, and they can be extracted through a number of different ways. Alcohol, glycerine, there's a few other different ways in which people can extract it. You can also get it in a dried herb. You can sometimes get it in like an essential oil. And so there's a couple of different ways. Also want to remind you that if there is a herb that you wish to work with and you're not able to obtain it, it's not something that you feel is ethical. Maybe it's a very rare sort of plant. Maybe it's not going to grow very well where you are. Maybe it would be a weed if you were to introduce it into your environment. You can also work with plants through the form of art. So you can work with obviously drawing, painting, photography. And if you're not into any of that ways of expression of a herb, you could also support another artist who engages with herbs in those sort of realms as well. But for this vlog, we're talking about why I like using dried herbs in the form of ingesting it into the body. So I'm going to talk about 5 main points, and the first one is affordability. Now, from what I can see, a lot of the time, the dried herb form is often a lot more affordable than some of the other ways in which people can work with herbs. And for some people, their abundance is a little bit blocked, or it's just not flowing well, or they're just feeling really stuck in this moment, in this time. And so, it's still really important that these sorts of herbs and herbs in general are easily available to people. So having them available to people in a dried form makes it a lot more affordable and a lot more accessible for a lot of people. Not everybody's got money to be spending on hundreds of dollars of different types of tinctures and powders of these kinds of herbs that you can work with. And so having them in dried form just means it's accessible usually to more people. So point number 2 is transportation. So I find with the dried form is that it's easier to move about with it than if it was fresh. In regards to tinctures and whatnot, yes, it can make it quite easy to be transportable if it's in glass bottles and all of that. And obviously you can also pick herbs fresh, or you can obtain herbs fresh, and you can also go through a drying process with them as well. And so with the transportation of, like, when you have those sorts of items in your custodianship, it means that you're able to move about more easier with them. So if you're living somewhat of a nomadic kind of lifestyle, it's just going to be a lot easier of having them in a dried form than keeping them fresh. Especially if you're on the road a lot, maybe you fly a lot, there's a lot of travel involved in your life. The dried form can make it a lot easier. However, when you start to look at crossing borders and whatnot, obviously there can be some restrictions around bringing in plant matter. It doesn't matter whether it's a powder, a tincture, a herb, or fresh. Obviously, the more fresh it is, the more closer to being fresh, and they are more likely to be questioned for it. And different herbs have different ways in which they're treated legally in different places. So point 3 is, with the dried form, from what I can see, it's a minimal chances of overdosing on the herb as well. when you start to really extract it and condense the potency, the increases, it means it's a lot easier to overdose on a herb. You can really overdo it on a herb. Some people don't like the fact with the dried herbs or fresh herbs that you can't get enough of them. And I guess the way in which I like to see it is that you can always ingest more, but once you've had a particular dosage or you've had it over a prolonged period of time, it can take a while to actually kind of detox yourself out of those herbs. So I like to err more so on the caution of gradually introducing more. I feel it's safer for us to be working in that way, especially because a lot of us around the world, especially if we're living in what we would call modern societies, we've become quite out of touch with herbology and with the plant spirits and with the knowledge and the wisdom that these plants have. So a lot of us are doing our best to remember, and there's still quite a way to go to get to a place where we would probably be considered quite wise. Now, of course, there are people that live around the world, that live in probably very remote parts of the world, that have maintained a lot of beautiful wisdom and deep wisdom about these plants. And what I'm referring to earlier is a lot of those that have been brought up in a modern society in some way. And then, of course, with the lower chances of overdose, there's also lower chances of there being allergic reaction and sensitivity issues as well, because you can gently introduce it, and obviously you can do your allergy tests with it before you start upping the dosage of the herb if you're trying to work with it for a particular purpose to help with healing an ailment or a challenge that you're going through. So point number 4 is that often with the dried herbs, it's usually just the dried herb. Obviously some of the tinctures that get made, there's alcohol, and with other extraction processes, there can be other elements and other ingredients added into it, so it's not just the herb. And that's not necessarily say it's a terrible thing, but if you are someone who prefers to work very simply with the plants, then the dried form can be a beautiful way to do that. And number 5 is this concept that I love to play around with, and I do it a lot, with my food and whatnot as well in general, is that obviously you're trying to eat and consume and have a relationship with these things in their whole form as much as possible. Now, this is not necessarily an edible plant or a herb, it's just a herb that I have on my windowsill, and for whatever reason I felt like it's a good prop to use today. Anywho, so when you're having these plants in the whole form, you're getting all these other information, should I say, that is letting your body know that you're going to be introducing it, especially if it's going inside. So, you're seeing the colour, you're seeing the shape, you are smelling it. What does it smell like? You're also tasting it. You're feeling it. There's a texture that you will feel with the plant, with what it is that you're going to put on the tongue, or you have on your tongue. And this prepares the body for what it is it's about to receive. How people often will talk a lot about how it's important to chew your food so many times, to prepare for the proper digestion of it. It's a very similar concept to having food in its whole form. Not only do people say it's healthier for you and you're less likely to have all these other additives and processed foods and blah, blah, blah with it, but there's a whole element of it that people tend to have even not remembered or have forgotten, or just don't know, is that with the whole foods, it's a whole message that your body is receiving before it consumes the food. It would be nice to know, if you do know yourself, if there's any studies that have been done of how the body reacts to food when, if you were to eat in the dark compared to in the daylight. If you were to be blindfolded while you eat raw food. If you were to have, obviously, your smell, your taste taken away. It'd be interesting. Let me know if there's any studies that have been done on that. But, for me, I don't necessarily need science to tell me, it's best to be having a lot of plants in their whole form as much as possible. Sometimes plants need to be soaked. I do get that. There's some elements that you may want to add to make things more digestible. And obviously with herbs, you'll often have them as tea, right? So it's almost like you've had the water taken out of it, you've dried a lot of that water out, and then you're adding water back in just to bring it back alive. Now, obviously there's some, downsides or insert whatever relevant word you wish to use for what I'm describing here with having dried plants or dried form of herbs instead of other forms. And one of them is that doesn't necessarily mean it's got a really potent full spectrum of the herb, especially compared to different ways that you can extract it and have it in a tincture. There are definitely processes that you can take a herb through that will really bring through even more of its medicinal properties. And so, that could be seen as like, oh, well, the dried herb is not as strong, so, people may gravitate towards a stronger form of the herb. And another downside is that obviously the shelf life isn't as long. When compared to fresh, obviously dried herbs are much longer, and there's obviously ways in which you can store and dry your herbs to ensure a reasonable amount of shelf life. And, there's also, I guess you could say, an environmental element to the dried herbs compared to other ways that you're extracting it. And there's this sort of concept of, nothing in nature is supposed to last forever. So it's okay, and it's part of a natural process of herbs, or just plant matter in general, or any forms of life, of dying and coming back into the soil, and it shouldn't last forever. But when you're wanting to have a nice medicine cabinet, and maybe you're not going to need it this year, but it's an ailment that comes up next year, or it's not something that you may use often. Sometimes people prefer to have it like in a tincture or another way of extraction, just so that they know, it's going to last for 5 years. So should I need it in 5 years? So yeah, that's probably one of the other downsides of the dried herb, is that it's not going to last as long as some other ways that it can be extracted and preserved. So yeah, that is a rundown, a go through, a journey of as to why I prefer dried herbs as my favourite form to work with herbs. It's not to say it's the only way and that it should be always the way that one works with them. And you're welcome to leave any comments or questions down below, and I will see you in the next vlog.